Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 55, Multi-Faith Education and Dialogue, with our guest via Skype, Denise Cush. Hey Denise, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hi, nice to be on it, Gina.
Excellent. So for those who don't know who you are, could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Denise Cush, and I'm currently Professor of Religion and Education at Bath Spa University in the UK, although in a few months' time I'll be retiring, so not for much longer.
Yeah.
I'm interested in lots of different religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Paganism, and other alternative spiritualities. And I have a special interest in multi-faith religious education in state-funded schools.
You have a new book out, right?
Yes, I edited a book which is called Celebrating Planet Earth, a Pagan Christian Conversation. And it emerged from an event we had at Imbolc 2014 at a place called Amadown, near to where I live, which is a kind of retreat and dialogue centre, and a place where people can go in safety and talk to each other in a really nice setting. And we had about 40 people, half Christian, half pagan, mostly Druids. It was originally going to be a Druid Christian conversation, but then the pagan side widened to include Wiccans and some animists. And the idea was that it's not the first time pagans and Christians have been involved in interfaith dialogue, but there haven't been many. And this was quite a special occasion because many leading Druids and other pagans were there, and Christians who had a particular interest in nature-based spiritualities. And we stayed together for a whole weekend and joined in joint rituals and celebrations and music, as well as just talking to each other. And as a result, the book came out of this weekend experience.
Do you find a lot of people kind of started to think maybe they are multi-faith out of that? You know, like on either side of the...
I think there are people, rather than being multi-faith, I think I would say that there are people who are drawing upon more than one spiritual tradition. So they may identify in one way as pagan, mainly as pagan or Christian, but they're happy to get on things in other spiritual traditions and to join with other people in other spiritual traditions. They're recognizing that there are differences as well.
So I guess maybe to kind of help the conversation along, what do you mean by multi-faith?
Well, for me, I use the word multi-faith in relation to my work in religious education in schools, which is rather different in the UK than in the States, in that we do have religious education in state schools, and it takes the form of a non-confessional religious education that draws upon a variety of religions. So it's sharing with children a whole variety of faiths and not just trying to persuade them to believe in one.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me back up here. So it's much more diverse of a religious education than just here's Christianity.
Exactly, yes. I mean, obviously, because it's Britain, Christianity plays a big part because it's various forms of Christianity, the majority faith, but we also look at a whole variety of different faiths. So that's partly what my interest is in more generally getting people to look at a variety of different religious traditions. And then within that, I've always wanted to include paganism, because people think, oh yeah, Christianity, we might have some Judaism, a bit of Islam, maybe Buddhism.
Yeah.
But maybe for many people, paganism would be going a step too far. Mm-hmm. But for me, I've always thought that we should include everybody. So it should be a completely inclusive religious education, including pagans and people of non-religious traditions or people who wouldn't call themselves religious.
Why do you think institutions, governments, only really think about interfaith or multi-faith in the terms of the big three, or maybe four if they include Buddhism?
Yes, well, probably because of their own education, partly, in that they may not know about the great variety of faiths that are out there. They may be afraid of some of the ones they don't know much about. I think people who are going beyond their own tradition may feel at first more comfortable. Say if they come from an Abrahamic tradition, they'd feel more comfortable with other Abrahamic traditions, so Christians talking to Muslims or Jews. And then when it gets to something like Buddhism, where it's not based on God, or paganism, which may have many gods, question mark, then people feel a bit more uncomfortable. They're kind of outside of the zone that they know about.
Yeah, I know I've seen that in my own work because, being a Wiccan Christian, I had a church for a while and I was trying to look for space in a different area to have services. And, and I was looking into a Episcopal church, which is basically the COE here, which, it was a really difficult thing because it wasn't just a matter of, oh, we'll just rent space to these people. It's like, do we really want somebody who's a witch here? And it became a really big thing for that particular church. Of course, they were also in a discernment year, so I kind of like dropped a bomb in the middle of their discernment. But, but it's not the first time I've run into that kind of thing where, people really don't think of interfaith or multi-faith outside of the religions that they know. Like the big religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, sometimes Buddhism.
Well, part of our weekend was the first thing the first part of the book as well, is clearing out some of the prejudices and fears and preconceptions that each side has about the other. Because, so unfortunately, a lot of the ways in which both Christians and pagans construct their identity is kind of against the other, and paganism for Christians and Christians for pagans has been a kind of the other against which they define themselves. So there's a lot of stories, a lot of myths in the bad sense that are told about the other. And so there's a lot of fear, a lot of prejudice, a lot of ignorance. And so that was the first thing we did in the meeting, is to try and let's get all this stuff out there and explore it and explode it, if you like, and get through to the other side. Part of the problem is the different meanings of words. The word pagan means different things to different people. Christian means different things to different people. And we've got to get through all that initial fear and prejudice and confusion, if you like.
Now, do you find that age plays a role in how people approach multi-faith? Because, do you find, people who are older have a harder time, being afraid of different things, whereas, the youth are just more curious about it? Or, because I know I've found it in different age groups, different reactions to people who have a multi-faith path or practice different religions.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to generalize because, younger people and older people who have very different views. Can't put all old people and young people in a category. Sure. But I think, my students, I would say generally are more tolerant of a variety of diversity than people my age and older. So I think they, because of the communications, because of technology, because they know more about the world, and they're more exposed to diversity, they're much more comfortable with diversity because that's where they live. So, and this is generalising. I mean, you can get narrow-minded young people and very open-minded older people. And in fact, quite a few of the people at this pagan Christian conversation were getting to kind of retirement age, and they'd been young in the 60s or 70s, and that was when things began to open up a bit. And so I think it's true what you say, that younger people generally are more open, but you can't generalise. Yeah,
that's kind of what I find, and I think there's also differences culturally between the US and the UK as well, because my wife and I talk about this a lot. My wife's from the UK, so and we talk about it quite a bit, and and just how it's there's different different ways of thought between people from the UK and in the US in general. It is a generalization, but there's a lot of Well, I mean, if you see, like, if you're looking at it right now, you know, there's a lot of stuff, especially about race and you know, and religion is kind of wrapped up in that as well. So you know, it's just really interesting listening to my wife talk about openness versus what is considered openness in America.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's different culture generally, and we have a different education system, and the news media say different things. So there are many. I think there are differences, but there are also similarities in that there's a lot of things that are the same, a lot of mutual influences. So I don't know what's your experience of the difference? I'd be interested to know.
Well, what we think of, like, let's see, how do I think of this here? You know, there's a certain assumptions about religion, like, you know, you're assumed Christian unless otherwise you say so. And it's kind of like you have to be Christian or else you're not morally sound.
Yeah.
Whereas when I talk about that with my wife, it's like, you know, people are assumed to be morally okay whether they're Christian or not.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I've noticed that there's a kind of presumption that religion is considered to be a good thing generally in the US, and sort of God is taken for granted much more than in Britain. I mean, there's about, I think it's 59% on the census said they were Christian, and there's about 30% would say they're non-religious, and it's not presumed that people are religious. In fact, it's almost the opposite, that people are thought to be non-religious when in fact they are religious, but they do it quietly.
Right.
So it's kind of, the presumption isn't that you are going to be a Christian or that you're going to be religious, unless you say otherwise. In fact, some of my students reported that, you know, the general opinion of some of the student leaders was that hardly any students were religious, which was completely wrong, because we did a survey and lots of students were Christian, pagan, Buddhist, all sorts of things, but they don't go around shouting about it particularly.
Yeah.
So yes, there is a different or public attitude to religion, I think.
Yeah. And I find it fascinating because, you know, and there's also like differences in the US too, between the coast, because like West Coast is much more liberal and has much more of a diversity of religion, where the East Coast is a little more like the UK, just in temperament, but there's still, you know, that general US assumption that, you know, you're Christian unless you say otherwise. And so I don't know, it to me, it causes more problems than it helps. And I think the other way around would seem to cause a little less problem. Although, you know, you've got your wackos in any religion, and they're going to be anywhere and everywhere, and it happens.
Oh, certainly, yes. I think there is a difference in the UK between the cities and the rural areas. So in the major cities like London or Birmingham or Bristol, near where we live, there's much more cultural diversity and religious diversity, and people are more likely to meet people from other backgrounds, whereas there are still country places where people don't meet people from other backgrounds so often. So there is that kind of thing in Britain as well.
So I was looking at your site this morning, the livingreligion.co.uk site. That you sent me earlier, and it looks really fascinating. And could you describe a little bit about what that project is and what you're doing with that? Yeah,
so in our university, it's been going on for longer than I've been teaching there, for about 35 years at least. But it's something I believe in a lot, is that nothing beats actually meeting people. So you can read a lot of books about pagans, Christians, Buddhists, and know a lot in theory, but it's not the same as actually meeting people and seeing how their faith works out in their everyday life. And so all our students that do religious studies or religion and philosophy have to, it's compulsory, they have to go and spend 7 days living with a religious community or a non-religious community that is different from their own or the one that they were brought up in. So it has to be a kind of alien world for them, if you like, a different world. And 99% of them have an amazing experience, because living alongside people and sharing their everyday lives, you realise, that they're human like you, and you've got a lot in common. You also get to see how their religion affects what they actually do. It's not a theoretical thing, it's how they live their lives and their experiences. You can join in their rituals, eat their food. And the other thing I like about it is that some of our students don't know what it's like to be in a minority, and they get that experience as well, because especially if they go live in a community and there's only one or two of them, you suddenly get that feeling, all these people believe this, do this, these are their customs, and they're not mine. And for somebody who's used to being in the majority and not being a minority in any way whatsoever, I think it's a good experience as well. But the main thing is that they get to see how religion works out in practice. And I strongly believe that kind of experiential encounter is worth 100 books.
Oh, absolutely. Because actually, I went to seminary. I graduated last year, actually. And we have a similar program we called Immersion, where you have to go into a society that is not necessarily what you normally do. And for myself, mine was amazing. I actually spent time in best word is a nunnery in San Francisco, and spent a week with sisters and living as the sisters do, and waking up early in the morning and praying. And it was just amazing. And you're right. There's nothing that really substitutes for the experience of actually getting up in the morning and going to prayer before breakfast, going to bed, going to prayer before going to bed at night, and then doing all of the work that they do. They do a lot of work in poor communities and missions and things like that. So it was just, you get to see a different part of the world and realize that you're not that different. Yeah,
exactly. And yet you can realize that there are different ways of going about living your life. It's one of the reasons that we set up this pagan Christian encounter, so that people had to be together. It was a very intense experience this weekend, because people were living together from the Friday evening till the Sunday evening in the retreat centre, which is in the country, away from everywhere. The mobile phones don't work, and you were kind of in a special space outside of your normal life.
Right.
And you can have a discussion and a debate about how your beliefs differ. But the one thing that came across to me as a result of the weekend, because I wouldn't identify as either a pagan or a Christian, though I have certain sympathies with both, is that arguing about doctrines and teachings, you could go on forever, but sharing in practical things, sharing in ritual, sharing in ceremony, sharing in social activism, things you can actually do together. And I think it occurred to me that that's the best place to start in interfaith dialogue. I know for some people, shared ritual is difficult because they feel that's going a step too far. But there are rituals that you can put together that everybody can feel comfortable with. And it just seemed to be shared stories, music. It just seemed a way of connecting with people that you wouldn't get if you just started arguing about deities or what happens when you die or the kind of theoretical belief side. And I think obviously that's important, and it's good to talk about it, discuss it, share ideas. But I thought maybe that comes later, after you get to know people and work with them and do things together.
Well, I think it can also diffuse the defensiveness, because, this is somebody now that that you're friends with, that is not going to eat babies for breakfast or something, So, it's easier to be human with each other when you know each other than, when you don't really know each other. It's much easier to be like, grr.
Yeah, exactly. So this is why this direct encounter and making friends with the other is absolutely vital. And seeing how much common ground we have and things that we can work on together. And the original idea for the weekend that the book came out of was actually partly from a local Anglican priest who was very, very interested in nature-based spirituality and making links with various pagan groups, especially Druids, who are kind of, you could see as the kind of indigenous to the UK, and Wiccans, which is often said to be the one religion that England has given to the world, from one point of view. But he was very, very interested in making these links. And the first thing he identified as common ground was this celebrating planet Earth, that both Christians and pagans are now fully aware of the fact that we share a very fragile planet, and that we can be at least united in that concern, and in a concern to reconnect with nature. And many Christians are perhaps discovering that in a way that pagans have had for some time.
And it's really fascinating too, like with the Pope's encyclical recently, that it just seems like the institutions are starting to catch up with the rest of us as far as that goes.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think it's a sign of the times. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Assisi in Italy, and back in 1986, there was a meeting of the different major faiths exploring attitudes to nature. And it's interesting how long it takes for these ideas to kind of filter through. But on the other hand, I guess environmental concerns and understanding of ecology is relatively new for everybody. And so it doesn't make much sense to go back and say, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, this and that group were incredibly environmental, because the issues weren't there really. We were more scared of nature in the past rather than now concerned with our impact on nature. So, but it's gradually dawning on everybody from religious backgrounds and non-religious backgrounds that this is something that we've got to get to grips with.
Yeah, and it's interesting talking about, what the difference between 2,000 years ago and now, I've seen different people from many different religions saying like, well, 2,000 years ago, this was this and this was that. And it's like, it's really hard to really compare religion then and religion now, because it's just so different and it has evolved so much, and I don't know, do you think that it's kind of not really a good comparison to say that the religion's the same then as it is now?
I think it causes a lot of problems because all religions have grown and developed and changed, and there's so much internal diversity in every so-called... The labels don't really work, the boxes don't really work. And I think that's something that's happening now. With another thing, talking to my students, many of them don't want to be put in a box. They don't want to label Christian or pagan or anything, because they want to draw on a variety of things. And I think this is happening more and more. I had a look at your website too, and people like yourself who drawing on a variety of traditions and don't want to be put in a little box with a label on it. And I think people more and more, I'm the same, I'm drawing a variety of different religious and non-religious traditions. And I think that's going to happen more and more because we can, because it's all out there and we can know about a variety of things. And for good and for ill, I mean, I think it's good in a way that we can draw upon a whole variety of things. I guess the temptation is just to pick the easy bits and maybe people can get confused. But I think that's the way things are going, that people are going to be able to draw upon a variety of traditions and not have to. It's a kind of... it's the other side of the coin from the retreat into fundamentalism. So both of those things are happening.
Right.
But okay, yeah.
Yeah. I kind of call like actually a friend of mine recently described it really well as it's the new Silk Road, right? Where 2,000 years ago you had the Silk Road bringing new and different ideas together and from different areas, and now you've got the internet, which is now is even more connecting us even more and bringing more and more new ideas to fore. And I think you're right. I think as we go forward, I think younger people are just trying to find a spiritual connection, and it doesn't really matter how that happens. Whether it's a mixture of things or a particular religion or, just going out into nature.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the groups I came across on the weekend that we had that I hadn't heard of before and I got very interested in is something called Forest Church, which is a fairly new Christian. The people who started it would talk about, they won't say Christianity, but they'd say part of the Christian tradition to kind of escape from the baggage of the traditional religion and the labels. But the basic idea is to engage and connect with nature, and their activities and ceremonies are open not just to Christians but to anybody. So because it stresses nature, pagans, druids, Wiccans, lots of people come along, and it's kind of open spirituality for anybody who's interested. Though the people who organise it spring from out of a Christian background. And I think this kind of thing is going to happen more and more, this kind of open spiritual tradition, offering to people what they can take from it. And different people may take different things.
Do you think traditional religions, specifically, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, that the traditions of that, do you think that will die out, or will it just morph into more of a maybe a quieter version of itself?
Well, it's always hard to predict, and I'm not a sociologist of religion, really, but I mix with a lot of sociologists of religion, and often they're very afraid of predicting the future. But those who do say there's just going to be more of everything. So there's going to the traditional religions are going to continue, and there'll be all sorts of varieties thereof, and but there will also be this sort of mixed spirituality as well, and there'll be different forms of atheism and non-religion, and so it's all going to go on side by side, I think. So where in the near future anyway, so where all this will head to eventually is kind of hard to say. And in my experience, it's usually the one thing you hadn't thought of.
Right. Well, and people surprise you too. I mean, I've been surprised, talking to younger people lately, just how much of a difference there is in looking at the other, because a lot of the younger people just don't understand, why, like I've done a lot of gender work around transgender issues, especially, and in particular in the pagan community. And it's really interesting talking to the younger pagans, especially pagans who grew up especially kids who grew up pagan. And we had there was this whole big blowout in the community about transgender women, specific in particularly in the Z Budapestian Dianics. And, it was a whole big thing. And a lot of the younger pagans were just kind of shrugged and went, why is this such an issue? Why is including transgender women an issue? They should be included. And it's just really fascinating to see what the younger generation is kind of like, whatever. Where for other generations, it's kind of like, Well,
that's something that I've really welcomed with my younger students, because they are open and they don't see it as a big deal, and it's just great. It's something that's happened within my lifetime that's great, that young people are just so much open to diversity and sexuality and people's identities, and they're just happy to accept people for however they want to be, and which I think is absolutely great. And I can see that a lot of symbolism That happens in Christianity as well. You get all this thing, well, women can't be priests because Jesus was a man, and there's all sort of the symbolism, the rituals is tied up with sort of stereotyped views of gender, and I can see why people initially feel, ooh, what's going on here? But I think I'm with the young people saying, well, what's the problem? There is not a problem here. Some of the work I've been doing is I've interviewed young people who identify as pagan or Wiccans and all kind of connected, similar things. And several of them were attracted to paganism because they felt more welcomed. They were lesbian or gay or transgender, and they felt that the traditional religions didn't make them feel welcome, and they felt more welcome in the pagan community. But as you say, not all parts of the pagan community. Yeah. But that was a big motif in the interviews I had. The other things that came out strongly were about empowerment. So my young people felt that the traditions that they had got into gave them the feeling of some sort of control over their lives that they hadn't had before, that they could actually take some action and do something. And it gave them a sense of identity, especially the young women, but also young men as well, in that they felt it gave them a kind of strong sense of identity. And this welcoming, this sort of openness was part of what helped, so that whatever their background was, they felt that they could belong.
And I think there's some of the more traditional religious groups, there's groups here and there that are doing that. Like the church that I go to, City Refuge, started by Bishop Yvette Flender, she's very much, her ministry is that, making a Christian group, a Christian church that will empower in the same way. But she's also very open to working with other faiths too. So it's really, really, really awesome. So I think, it's kind of coming full circle. Like the pagan openness thing is kind of starting to have more influence in other traditions, and, the more open sides of those traditions are helping to keep Christianity, Islam, and all that alive to survive through the changing world, I think.
Yeah, I think so, because, well, I sometimes feel like saying keep up too.
Right.
Yeah, keep up with the world. It's, things are changing, and you've got to be with the world as it is now, and not as it was in the past. So I think some exciting things are happening, but also scary things are happening in other parts. So it's a kind of watch this space and see what. But I think it's all going to go on side by side for some time.
I think you're right. There's a question I want to ask you too. Coming out of just graduating from seminary myself, and you being in academia, what do you think is the future of religious education? Because, we see in the U.S., at least from what I've seen, is that, seminaries and religious studies programs are really declining. And, there's not as many people going into that as there used to be. And do you see... What do you see as the future of that, and how do you think it has to morph in order to keep these programs alive?
Yeah, I think we're also, it's religious studies is doing okay in the UK, but we're never complacent, and it's always a small subject. It's not terribly, it's not a big popular subject,
right,
or something like that. So I think people are put off by their preconceived ideas about what it might be. And so people tend to presume that it would be Christian theology that you'd be studying. And I think religion has got a lot of negative associations with it, because all people hear, you only get religion in the news mainly when something terrible's happened associated with religion. And so religion's got a kind of negative feel to it. And so we keep wondering about changing the name of religious studies. So we changed the name of our degree to religion, philosophy and ethics. And some school, because we have religious education in schools in Britain, some school departments call themselves philosophy and belief, or, escape from I call it the R word. Don't mention the R word. It scares people. But so part of it is the kind of public image of the subject. And so both at university level and in schools, in Britain, we're trying to do a lot of work to try and get the image right, because people have an idea, especially older people have an idea that it was like it was when they were at school long ago. And it's religion in school is good in theory in Britain, but it's not very well supported or resourced. So sometimes it's not that good in practice. So, but most of the research shows that young people enjoy it. They just don't always think it's that important, because is it going to make them lots of money, or
right?
whatever reason. And I sometimes think it's not the young people; it's their parents saying, "What are you going to do with that? Is that going to get you a job, etc."
Right.
In fact, it is a really good subject for a lot of jobs, especially dealing with people and diversity. But it is an issue, and I think there's enough young people who are interested in it to keep the subject going. But again, like religions themselves, the study of religion has to evolve.
Right.
And for instance, one of the shocking statistics in the UK is out of theology and religious studies, I think I've got the statistic right, there's only 16% of professors are women, say. So it has to change again, keep up with where society is, and it's got to be made attractive. So again, at my university, we take a very diverse view of religions, and we do a lot about as many religions as we can kind of cram in. We do paganism as part of the program, and we look at new religious movements, and we look at atheism and non-religion, and we look at Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, etc. And also look at philosophy and ethical issues. So I think we need to make sure that the subject, and we do a lot about gender and religion, sexuality and religion, and the subject at university and in schools needs to keep renewing itself and updating itself in order to meet the needs of the young people who are studying. So we hope that it'll continue to be a successful subject, but I doubt it will ever be the most popular university subject.
That's true. And, I know my school has been changing its focus, because it's been switching its focus to social justice and making more of people that are well-rounded in diverse things, rather than just, specifically Christianity. And I think you're right. I think, the evolution has to come with it. And I don't think, I don't think these programs will have any choice in the matter, especially, especially in like 5-10 years. The world's going to be very different than it is right now. So.
Yeah. So I think in just a sheer marketing sense, they'll have to provide what the customer wants. Yeah.
What about academic thought? Because I'll have to confess, when I've read theology books, from different theologians, I sit there and go, oh God. It's like, what are you talking about? And it's, and as I went through seminary, I got more of the language and stuff down. So I did know what they were talking about, but it seems just kind of like, you want to fall asleep sometimes, or it's just kind of like so outdated. Even some of the more modern stuff seems outdated, that it's just kind of like, oh, come on.
Yeah. I do recognize that feeling. Because I started out in my degree long ago was traditional Christian theology and learning Hebrew and Greek to read the Bible in the original and all that. And when I started my career as a teacher in school, and as I was training to be a teacher, I discovered two things. One was that I actually enjoyed teaching, and the other one was that my traditional theology degree wasn't much good preparation for dealing with the young people and what they needed. So I went off, I had a kind of conversion experience, if you like, from theology to religious studies. So although in England the two subjects are kind of together. There's a lot of tensions. In one way, it's the same subject. In another way, it isn't. And there are tensions between theology and religious studies. And I'm definitely on the religious studies side now, even though I enjoyed the theology. But I'm much more interested in taking a diverse approach and looking at a lot of different religions and looking at what happens now, really. Obviously, you have to understand the history to understand how we've got to where we are now. But I'm interested in religion in the contemporary world and what it's doing and what people are doing, and actually meeting people now who may live next door to you, who may believe and do different things. So I think there's a kind of tension between theology and religious studies. But what's happened in the UK as well is that philosophy of religion has become very popular in schools. But I have a problem with that as well, because that philosophy of religion tends to be very kind of Western. So just as we expanded from looking at Christianity and religions to looking at lots of religions, in philosophy there tends to be a big, it's sort of this American, European continent philosophers, British philosophers, and they're either atheist or Christian, basically. Those are your two choices in philosophy of religion. And there's a whole lot of other options. And so that's another thing we're trying to do at our university is do Eastern philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Japanese philosophy, Indian philosophy. And as well as that, the kind of division between religion and philosophy that since the Enlightenment has been in our culture is not quite the same in other cultures. You know, there's sort of, is this a religion or a philosophy? Those categories don't hold. So I think the subject, as we were talking about, and I do understand what you mean about some of those theology textbooks.
Just like,
how much more of this can I read? And it's not just Christian theology that gets like that.
I know.
So, but I think the answer is meeting. Well, I suppose I've been a teacher for many years, and you have to meet the students where they are, really. And if the subject matter is a long way from where they are, you've got to make some connections.
Well, we are just about out of time. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to picking up that anthology because I think it would be really fascinating. So we're going to have a link to that in the show notes, and we have a link to the Living Religion site. Is there any other way that people can get in touch with you, to ask you questions or get more information?
I can give you my university email. I don't want millions of people. If a lot of people, I'm sure they won't. But people could email me at d.cush at bathspa, bathspa.ac.uk. Okay. Can't promise if there's that I'll get back to people straight away, but eventually I would.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. I mean, I think people would be pretty good about that. So, all right. So thank you so much for joining us. And this has been great.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me on, because I very much enjoyed our conversation, Gina, and maybe we'll keep in touch.
Yeah.
Bye.
I'd like to thank Denise for joining us on this episode. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. You can also financially support this podcast through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.